The room stayed silent long after I slid the yellowed mortgage receipts across the dining table. You could hear the grandfather clock in Daniel's foyer ticking like a verdict. One by one, the guests lifted the papers, reading dates that stretched back 31 years, canceled checks signed in my hand, payment books stamped month after month, every dollar proving I had carried that house long before my son ever made his first commission. Daniel tried to laugh it off at first, called it a misunderstanding, but Martin cleared his throat and placed one final folder beside the dessert plates. It held the county deed records, the lien release, and copies of the trust amendment Daniel had never known existed. The house had never been his inheritance to boast about. It was still mine. The color left Monica's face first. Then Daniel's confidence cracked. A man who had spent years performing success suddenly looked like a frightened boy caught stealing from his own mother. One guest asked quietly if Daniel had also told lenders he financially supported me. Martin answered before Daniel could.
Yes.
Several times. The room shifted. I watched people begin putting together what Daniel had done, how he had inflated his image through a lie built on my humiliation. 3 weeks later, that lie cost him more than pride. His bank froze a pending refinance while documentation was reviewed. His partners voted him out of a development deal worth more than $2 million after discovering false personal financial representations in loan disclosures. The country club board where Monica had loved to parade their status quietly revoked their membership after the scandal spread. In our town, reputation traveled faster than wildfire, and once people saw a son had publicly shamed the woman who paid for the roof over his head, sympathy did not fall in his direction. But the deepest consequence came in my attorney's office. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand apologies. I signed papers. I revoked Daniel's control over every future estate decision. I transferred the property into an irrevocable trust benefiting my grandchildren, with strict conditions Daniel could never touch.
Then,
I authorized the sale of the old family house on my terms. At closing, I stood in sunlight outside the title office and held the cashier's check in my hand, the same hand that had once balanced grocery money and mortgage payments. I bought a lakefront cottage 80 miles north, small, white, peaceful, with a porch that faced the water. Paid cash. Daniel came there once, months later, asking to explain, asking if we could start over. I listened. Then I handed him a framed copy of the very first mortgage receipt from 1993. I told him, "You didn't lose me when you lied at dinner. You lost me when you made my sacrifice into your punchline."
he cried.
I did not. Some reckonings do not need anger to be final. They need truth. The final insult he made against me became the instrument of his undoing. People still talk about that anniversary party, but not because of Daniel's toast. They remember the old woman who opened her purse and dismantled a lifetime of deception with paper. And they remember what I said before I left that night, the last words I ever spoke to him in that house. I never lived off my son. My son lived off a story I allowed. Then I took it back. And I did. Completely. My name stayed on the legacy. His came off the trust. His lie cost him money, standing, and the image he worshipped. My silence bought me victory. By the time spring came, I was drinking coffee on my porch at sunrise, mortgage-free, debt-free, answerable to no one. For the first time in years, I was not surviving inside someone else's version of my life. I owned the truth again. And that, more than any receipt, was what paid in full. My mother lives off me now, my son said, lifting a crystal glass while 12 dinner guests laughed politely around the long mahogany table, and in that instant, I realized humiliation has a sound. It sounds like people pretending not to notice your heart crack. I kept smiling. I even raised my own glass. But inside my handbag, beneath a linen handkerchief and an old leather wallet, rested a stack of mortgage receipts that would change everything before this story was over. The anniversary dinner was supposed to honor Daniel and Monica's 20th year of marriage. Monica had chosen white roses for every centerpiece, silver candles, imported champagne, the kind of evening meant to signal status. Their house sat on a hill outside Hartford, 5 bedrooms, stone facade, a circular driveway Daniel liked to call his reward for hard work. I had heard him say that before. What I had never heard until that night was my son turning me into part of his performance. Mom's lucky I keep her afloat, he added, smiling toward a couple from his investment firm. Retirement isn't cheap. There was a soft murmur. A few awkward chuckles. Someone touched my arm as if offering pity. I looked at Daniel, at the same boy whose lunch I packed for 12 straight school years, whose college tuition I covered by working overtime in a county records office, and I saw a stranger rehearsing a lie he had told too many times. Monica leaned close and whispered almost kindly, "Don't be sensitive, Evelyn. He's only joking." But jokes reveal loyalties. I set down my fork. My hands did not shake. That surprised even me, because there was a time I would have swallowed the insult and driven home in tears. But age does something useful if you let it. It teaches silence can hold its own blade. Earlier that afternoon, I had stood in my bedroom deciding whether to bring the old receipts at all. 30 years of canceled checks bundled with a faded ribbon. Every mortgage payment on the first family house. Every sacrifice Daniel had forgotten, or perhaps chosen to rewrite. I nearly left them in the lockbox. Nearly believed old women should keep peace at any cost. But something in me had shifted months ago, long before this dinner. Too many small dismissals. Too many comments about me being looked after. Too many moments where Monica corrected family stories, so Daniel sounded self-made, and I sounded dependent. The lie had grown roots. Tonight, I heard how deep. Daniel moved on to another story, boasting about refinancing properties, while waiters served salmon over wild rice. But I was no longer listening to his voice. I was listening to memory. The sound of rain through the roof in 1994 when I mailed a payment we could barely afford. The scrape of my wedding ring against grocery cart handles as I counted dollars. The promise my late husband made before he died. Never let anyone erase what we built. Across the table, Martin Cole, my husband's old attorney, had gone unusually still. He met my eyes once. Just once. It was enough. I understood then I was not the only one hearing something rotten beneath Daniel's polished charm. I reached slowly into my handbag and touched the folded papers. Not yet, I thought. Let him keep talking. Let the lie grow large enough for everyone to see when it falls. The laughter faded, but its sting stayed in the air like perfume that lingered after guests moved on. Monica was describing a vineyard trip in Napa when Daniel leaned back in his chair and began telling another story about how difficult it was, in his words, to support aging parents. He said it lightly, almost as though generosity were one more asset in his portfolio. I watched the faces around the table. Some nodded with admiration. Some looked uncomfortable. None of them knew they were listening to a performance built on borrowed credit. I had seen Daniel do this before, though never with me as the punchline. When he was 12, he once told a teacher he had finished a science project alone, though I had stayed up past midnight helping him glue every piece into place. Even then, he liked applause more than truth. I used to think maturity would soften that. Sometimes it only polishes it. The candles had burned lower. Wax pooled beside silver holders. Through the windows, the March wind moved branches against the glass, and I felt suddenly returned to another dining room decades earlier, smaller, modest, linoleum floors curling at the edges, where Daniel had done homework while I balanced mortgage envelopes against a coffee tin budget. We did not have imported wine then. We had meatloaf on Wednesdays and utility bills tucked under salt shakers. Yet somehow I had felt richer. Monica touched Daniel's arm and asked him to tell the story of how he bought his first rental property. Bought. The word settled heavily, because I remembered the down payment that began that story. Money from the second mortgage I took after Harold
Died.
Money Daniel had called a temporary loan and never once publicly acknowledged. At the far end of the table, Martin set down his fork and asked, almost casually, "Daniel, did your mother ever help with your early investments?" Daniel laughed too quickly. "Not financially," he said. "She depended on me, if anything." It was small, the way Martin lifted one eyebrow, but I caught it. He knew, or suspected enough. My pulse remained steady. That surprised me. I had expected humiliation to feel hot, chaotic. Instead, it felt cold, clarifying. the kind of cold that makes hidden shapes visible. I excused myself and stepped into the powder room, not because I needed composure, but because I needed memory. In the mirror, I saw a woman with silver hair pinned neatly, pearl earrings from an anniversary long gone, and eyes far calmer than the woman who once avoided conflict at all costs. I opened my handbag and looked at the folded receipts again. The oldest one was browned at the edges. March 1993. $482.17. Paid by check from a county clerk earning less than $30,000 a year. I smiled at the number. It had more integrity than every boast in the next room. When I returned, dessert had arrived. Lemon tort.
Coffee.
Daniel was entertaining a story about his sacrifice, and someone called him a devoted son. That was when Monica made her mistake. She laughed and said, "Evelyn has been comfortable for years because Daniel takes care of everything." Takes care of everything. I set down my coffee cup. Then I reached into my handbag and rested my fingers on 30 years of paper. Let them speak one layer deeper, I thought. Let the lie gather its final witnesses. No one noticed the shift in me when Monica said those words. That was the advantage of being underestimated. People stop watching closely when they believe they have already defined you. I lifted my coffee cup and took one slow sip while Daniel continued smiling for the room, unaware something old and buried had begun to rise. Martin leaned back in his chair and studied me with an expression I remembered from years ago, when Harold had trusted him with estate papers after his first heart scare. He had the face of a man who knew timing mattered. I had spent much of my life speaking too soon to defend myself. That night, for once, silence was doing the work. Someone asked how long I had lived in the old family house before Daniel helped me move after Harold died. Help me move. I almost smiled at how lies grow by collecting innocent assumptions. Before I could answer, Daniel said, "Mother stayed there until upkeep got too much." I stepped in. The phrase echoed strangely, because my mind went back to a January morning 22 years earlier when I had stood in snow thick enough to cover my boots, scraping ice from the windshield before driving to the bank to make a payment due by noon. Daniel had been in college then. He had called that week asking for textbook money. I sent it. I made the mortgage too. There are women whose sacrifices disappear because they make them quietly. I had nearly become one of them. But memory can be its own ledger. Monica was now telling one of the wives about renovating the guest wing, using the phrase old money as if they had inherited elegance instead of curated it. I looked around the room and realized nearly everyone here knew only the polished version of my son. None knew the year I sold my mother's engagement brooch to cover Daniel's business losses. None knew the first rental property he boasted about began with funds from a home equity loan in my name. I had never told those stories because mothers are trained to make sacrifice invisible. It makes sons comfortable. It also makes revision easy. Then Martin did something small and dangerous. He asked Daniel whether he still had the framed photograph from his first closing day. Daniel laughed and said it was in his study.
Interesting, Martin said.
I seem to remember your mother standing in that photograph holding the cashier's check.
The air changed.
Subtle, but unmistakable. A woman across from me looked from Martin to me. Curiosity, replacing polite detachment. Daniel gave a dismissive shrug. My mother likes to feel involved. That sentence settled heavier than the others. Not because it was crueler, because it revealed contempt stripped of charm. I placed my napkin beside the dessert plate. My fingers no longer rested on the receipts. They held them. Beneath the table, paper edges pressed against my palm. I thought of Harold's voice, low and steady, saying never argue with people who profit from forgetting. Show them.
Just show them.
Monica noticed my handbag open and gave me a quick assessing glance, as though sensing movement she could not name. Daniel reached for another story, another performance, another chance to deepen the myth. I let him begin. Because some truths need the lie to reach full height before they can bring it down. Daniel was speaking about discipline now, about responsibility, about how younger people did not understand what it took to build something substantial, and the irony was almost tender in its cruelty. I had once admired his confidence. Now I could hear where confidence had hardened into entitlement. He was not merely rewriting history for strangers. He had rewritten it for himself. That was the more dangerous lie. It survives because the teller believes it. A woman beside Monica asked whether Daniel had always been ambitious. I almost answered before Monica did. Since he was young, she said. He has always taken care of everyone. The words floated over candlelight, elegant and false. And suddenly I remembered a summer afternoon in 1987 when Daniel was 9 years old, sitting on the porch steps while Harold taught him how to hammer loose boards back into place. Harold had looked at him and said, "A man is measured by what he honors, not what he claims." Daniel had nodded solemnly. I had believed he understood. Memory has a way of returning when betrayal sharpens the air. I saw again the first little house Harold and I bought for $82,000, pale blue siding, 1 bathroom, crooked gutters. Every Friday, I entered expenses into a spiral notebook, rounding grocery prices to save quarters. When Harold's factory cut shifts, I took a second job typing records at night. The mortgage receipts in my handbag were not paper to me. They were winters survived, birthdays made modest, shoes resold instead of replaced. They were proof sacrifice has handwriting. And then there was the second mortgage, the one Daniel had begged me to take when his first real estate deal nearly collapsed. He had stood in my kitchen, 30 years old and sweating through a dress shirt, saying if he lost the deposit his career would be over before it began. I remember sliding loan papers across this very sun and saying, "Do not make me regret believing in you." He kissed my forehead that day, called me his guardian angel. I had not thought of those words in years. Across the table, Martin asked a simple question that landed with unusual weight. "Daniel, do your partners know how you financed your first acquisition?" Daniel smiled in that practice way men do when they intend to dodge without appearing to. "Family support in the broad sense," he said. "Nothing unusual. Broad sense." I almost laughed. The language of evasion always dresses itself as sophistication. Monica shifted. She had begun watching Martin, now more than the guests. She sensed a current under the conversation. Smart women do. But even she had not yet imagined how old paper could become a weapon. One of the men from Daniel's firm remarked that parents leaning on successful children was becoming common these days. He meant nothing by it. Casual conversation. But it touched something raw enough that I finally spoke. Only one sentence. Quietly. Sometimes children lean farther than they remember. The table fell still for a breath. Daniel gave a strained smile and reached for his wine. I saw the first flicker of unease in him. Very small, but real. Because beneath arrogance lives fear, and fear recognizes truth before pride does. My hand slid fully into the handbag. I drew out the first folded receipt, still hidden below the tablecloth. March 1993. Paid in full. I did not lift it yet. Not while Daniel still believed he controlled the story. But for the first time that evening, I knew with perfect calm that he did not. The room had become too attentive for casual conversation, though no one named the change. It lived in pauses now, in forks set down more softly, in glances that lingered a second too long. Daniel tried to recover momentum by launching into another story, one about a deal in Boston and the risks of carrying people who do not pull their own weight. It was meant to be clever. Instead, it sounded rehearsed. The first crack in performance is rarely volume. It is repetition. Monica sensed it too. Her smile had tightened. She began interrupting more, filling spaces Daniel left open, steering talk toward vacations and schools and property values. It was the reflex of someone used to managing perception. But perception had already started slipping. Martin folded his napkin and asked whether anyone would like to see an old photograph he remembered from Daniel's first closing. "I believe there was a framed copy in your study," he said. Daniel hesitated only a beat, but I saw it. Then he stood and laughed. "Come on, Martin. You always did romanticize humble beginnings." Yet he rose and left the room to fetch it. Monica followed halfway, then stopped, uncertain whether to stay and monitor the table or protect whatever waited in that study. She chose the table. A mistake. As soon as Daniel disappeared, one of the women leaned toward me and asked quietly, Were you really involved in his early deals? There was kindness in her tone, but also something else. Doubt about what she had been told. I looked at her and said, "Some investments begin in places no one photographs." Martin smiled into his coffee. He knew I was readying something. When Daniel returned with the framed photo, he held it up almost triumphantly. There he was, younger, thinner, standing before a brick duplex with oversized confidence in his grin. But what he had forgotten was what Martin had remembered. In the corner of that photograph, half visible beside him, I stood holding the cashier's envelope from the bank. One of Daniel's partners squinted. "Is that your mother?" Daniel waved a dismissive hand. "She came for moral support." Moral support. The phrase fell dead, because Martin extended his hand. "May I?" Daniel passed him the frame. Martin removed the backing with surprising ease and slid from behind it an old folded settlement sheet he had apparently tucked there decades ago.
He looked at
Me first, asking permission without words. I nodded. Then he read aloud the line item showing source of funds for the down payment. Proceeds from Harper Residence Equity Loan. My name, not Daniel's.
Mine.
Silence moved through the room, like weather. Monica's face lost color. Daniel opened his mouth and closed it again. In that suspended stillness, I placed the first mortgage receipt on the tablecloth. Then another. Then another. Yellowed paper against white linen. 30 years of memory arranged in neat rows.
No speech. No accusation.
Just proof. The guests leaned in. One man whispered, almost involuntarily, "My God." Daniel reached toward the papers as if to gather them up, and I covered them gently with my hand. Not possessive. Final. For the first time all evening, he looked not angry, but frightened. Because he understood what I had understood much earlier. Once a lie meets documentation in a room full of witnesses, it does not survive as opinion. It becomes exposure. And we were only at the beginning. No one reached for dessert after that. The lemon torte sat untouched, softening beneath the dining room lights, while every eye remained on the receipts spread before us. I had imagined this moment many times in private, but I had never imagined how quiet exposure could sound. There was no shouting.
No dramatic confrontation.
Only the rustle of paper as one guest lifted a receipt dated June 1996 and read the amount aloud under his breath, as if saying it too loudly might make the truth heavier. Daniel stood rigid at the end of the table, one hand still resting on the back of his chair. I knew that posture. It was the way he stood as a boy when caught inventing stories he could not sustain. Some habits age with us. Monica recovered first. "This is absurd," she said, too quickly. "No one is saying Evelyn did not help in the past." Help. There it was again. The language of reduction. 30 years of payments collapsed into a favor. But before I could answer, Daniel's partner Robert leaned forward and tapped the settlement sheet Martin had revealed. "You told us your first acquisition was self-funded." Not angry. Simply factual. Sometimes calm. Questions cut deepest. Daniel attempted a laugh, but it sounded brittle. "There is context you all do not understand." I looked at him and thought, for years that sentence belonged to me. Mothers are always expected to explain what sons have done. Tonight, I had no intention of rescuing him with context. Martin reached into his briefcase then, almost as though this were routine, and withdrew copies of county lien releases Harold had once insisted he retain. I had forgotten he still had them. He passed one to Robert, another to the woman beside Monica. The evidence moved hand to hand, not unlike communion, quietly, reverently, and with every passing second Daniel's version of himself weakened. Then came the question neither he nor Monica expected. "If your mother paid the mortgage," Robert asked, "why have you told lenders you support her housing expenses?" The room stilled in a deeper way. Even Monica did not move. I felt rather than saw Daniel falter. Just enough. His eyes shifted toward me, almost pleading, not for forgiveness, but for intervention. Once, I would have stepped in to soften the moment. But truth does not bloom if you keep shielding lies from weather. "Daniel," I said, and my voice surprised even me with its steadiness, "do you remember asking me to sign the home equity loan papers in 1998? He did not answer. He could not. Because memory, when spoken before witnesses, becomes something difficult to deny. I pulled from the bundle one final document I had brought but not planned yet to show. A notarized promissory note bearing his younger signature, acknowledging the down payment funds as a loan from me. I slid it toward him. Monica whispered his name, barely audible. Robert leaned back slowly, understanding far more than property history was unraveling. Reputation was. I did not feel triumph. Only clarity. There is a difference. Triumph needs an enemy. Clarity needs only light. Daniel sat down at last. Not from exhaustion, I thought, but because standing inside a collapsing myth takes more strength than most men possess. Outside, wind tapped branches against the windows. Inside, nobody spoke until the woman beside me looked at the rows of receipts and said softly, almost to herself, she did not live off him at all. No one corrected her. No one could. And in that silence, I realized the story had already changed hands. People began leaving earlier than planned, but not in the easy, satisfied way guests drift from a successful dinner. They left carefully, speaking lower, carrying with them the kind of story people know will be retold before morning. I remained seated while coats were gathered in the foyer and Monica forced brittle smiles at the door. Daniel did not escort anyone out. He stayed at the head of the table as though movement itself might confirm collapse. After the last car disappeared down the drive, the house felt stripped of performance. Only family remained, or what passed for it. Monica was first to speak. You humiliated him, she said, voice thin with disbelief, as though exposure were somehow cruelty. I looked at her and almost pitied how sincerely she believed appearances mattered more than facts. No, I said. I corrected him. Daniel stood abruptly and began pacing near the windows, insisting the lender statements Robert had mentioned were exaggerated, harmless shorthand. Nothing fraudulent. Harmless. That word caught in the room. Martin, still seated, folded his glasses and said quietly, misrepresenting financial dependency on formal disclosures is not shorthand. The sentence landed harder than accusation would have. Daniel stopped pacing. Monica looked from him to Martin, and for the first time, I saw fear outrun arrogance in her face. It was not the receipts that frightened her now. It was consequence. Daniel poured himself another drink with a hand not entirely steady. This was never about money, he said. But I knew better. Betrayal often wears emotional disguises while feeding on material things. I had suspected for months there was more beneath the insults. That night suspicion found shape. Martin asked whether Daniel still used the line about supporting me in his pending refinance package. Daniel said nothing. Silence can confess where speech refuses. Then Martin did something that shifted the ground again. He told us Robert had recently mentioned Daniel, leveraging his image as sole provider in a charitable foundation board application, painting himself as a devoted son supporting an elderly parent alone. Not merely vanity, strategy. Reputation monetized. I felt no shock, only the eerie calm of puzzle pieces settling. Monica whispered, you told them that? And even she sounded betrayed. Strange. How deception offends most when it circles inward. Daniel began defending himself in fragments about networking, optics, harmless positioning. But each explanation made the pattern plainer. I thought back to small things once dismissed. Daniel insisting holiday dinners be hosted in his name, though I funded half the catering. Monica correcting relatives when they mentioned my help with the first duplex. Stories edited one omission at a time until ownership changed. This had not begun tonight. Tonight had merely exposed architecture. Martin stood to leave then, but before doing so, he placed his hand lightly on my shoulder and said, do not destroy those documents. You may need them. Legal possibility entered the room like winter air under a door. After he left, Daniel asked if I intended to ruin him. I studied my son, this middle-aged man still expecting a mother to absorb fallout for him. You built something on my silence, I said. If it falls, ask what held it up. He had no answer. Monica retreated upstairs without another word. Daniel remained alone at the table staring at the receipts. For a long while neither of us spoke. Then he asked, almost like the boy he once was, "Why did you keep all of these?" I gathered the papers slowly, aligning edges with care. "Because truth ages," I said, "but it does not expire." And as I placed them back into my handbag, I understood the dinner had ended, but the reckoning had only begun. The next morning, rain tapped against my kitchen windows while the receipts lay spread across my breakfast table, no longer relics, but instruments. I had slept little, yet I felt strangely rested, as if some long tension in my spine had loosened. At 9:14, the phone rang. "Daniel." I let it ring twice before answering. His voice carried a softness I had not heard in years. The softness of someone negotiating after discovering he no longer holds leverage. He said the evening had gotten out of hand, that emotions had run high, that perhaps we should present a united story if anyone asked questions. United story. Even now he reached first for narrative. I stirred my coffee and said very little. Silence unsettles people who expect maternal reassurance. By noon, Monica called too, all polished concern, asking whether I might tell Robert there had been confusion over old documents. Confusion. Another word meant to blur what paper had made sharp. I told her I would think about it. I had no intention of helping them erase the stain. But I had learned something important at dinner. Truth did not need to rush. It needed witnesses. So, I did something Daniel would never have expected. I let him keep talking. Over the next week, I accepted his invitations to 2 public events I would once have declined. A charity luncheon where he sat on the foundation board. A cocktail reception for investors at a restored hotel downtown. Monica seemed almost relieved, mistaking my calm for surrender. But I was not retreating. I was allowing repetition. Because a lie spoken once can be denied. A lie repeated after exposure becomes self-inflicted evidence. At the luncheon, Daniel introduced me to donors as his mother, whom he had cared for in retirement. The phrase was smoother now, more cautious, but the architecture remained. I smiled, said nothing. Robert was there. So were 2 board members who had attended the anniversary dinner. They exchanged a glance I did not miss. Seeds were doing what seeds do. At the hotel reception, it happened again. Daniel, after too much confidence and perhaps too much bourbon, joked that family obligations had made him the responsible one since youth. There was laughter, thinner this time. A man near the bar asked, "Even after your mother financed your first property?" Daniel brushed it away with a grin too quick to be natural. I stood beside a marble column listening as he chose pride over prudence, one time too many. That was the trap, though he built it himself. Later that evening, Robert approached me privately and said there were discrepancies in a pending refinance review. Lenders were asking questions about representations tied to dependent support. He did not say trouble. He did not need to. I drove home beneath streetlights, reflecting on wet pavement, and thought of Harold saying some men fall because others push them. Others fall because they keep stepping onto ground already broken. Daniel was doing the latter. 3 days later, Martin came by with forms and coffee from the bakery Harold used to like. We sat at my kitchen table while he outlined options: protect the estate, formalize the trust revisions, preserve records in case Daniel's financial claims invited scrutiny. I signed nothing yet, but my hand rested near the pen. Outside, wind moved through the maple tree. Inside, something colder and clearer was taking shape. I had not exposed my son merely to win an argument at dinner. I had exposed a pattern. And now that pattern was beginning to move beyond family gossip into consequence. The lie had survived years in private. It would not survive daylight twice. By early April, the story had moved beyond whispers. It traveled in those careful, respectable channels where scandal wears a necktie. A banker called Daniel requesting supplemental documentation for the refinance package. A foundation committee postponed a vote on his board appointment. Robert stopped returning his messages as quickly. None of it was dramatic from the outside. Consequence rarely arrives with thunder. It comes through delays, questions, signatures withheld. Daniel began calling more often, not to apologize, to assess damage. I could hear it in every word. Have you spoken to Martin? Did you tell anyone else about the loan papers? If lenders contact you, what will you say? Each question pretended concern while circling self-preservation. I answered little. There is a mercy in letting people hear their own panic. Then came the spring donor gala at the Historical Society, an event Monica would never have missed in happier times. Crystal chandeliers, string quartet, old families pretending money carries virtue. Daniel was scheduled to give a toast honoring community legacy. He asked me not to attend.
That
Alone guaranteed I would. I wore navy silk Harold once liked, and the pearl earrings from our 30th anniversary. Small armor. The ballroom glowed in candlelight much like that first dinner, but this time the room already knew something had shifted. Faces turned when I entered. Some with sympathy, some with curiosity. Both are forms of power if you understand them. Daniel's speech began smoothly enough. He spoke of stewardship, sacrifice, generations building for those who follow. The words might have passed unnoticed months earlier, but truth alters how audiences hear familiar lines. Midway through the toast, one board member asked from the front table whether Daniel's remarks included the maternal support discussed at the anniversary dinner. It was asked politely.
publicly.
A surgeon's cut. Silence spread. Daniel tried humor. It failed. His smile did not reach his eyes. Then Robert stood. I had not known he would. He said due diligence had uncovered inconsistencies in representations tied to family dependency and that transparency mattered in matters of public trust.
No accusation.
Only fact. But fact spoken before donors carries its own authority. Daniel looked toward me then, perhaps hoping I would lower my eyes. Signal rescue. Instead, I opened my handbag and placed one single mortgage receipt on the linen beside my water glass. March 1993. The oldest one. I did not wave it. I did not need to. The gesture alone carried the room. Someone near the back murmured. So, it was true. Monica rose as if to leave, then sat again, realizing retreat would look like admission. Daniel abandoned the prepared toast. His voice thinned. For the first time in his life, charm had no market. Afterward, conversations bent around us in careful circles. A trustee informed Daniel his nomination review would be suspended. Another guest quietly told me my husband would be proud. That sentence reached somewhere deeper than vindication. Outside under the portico, Daniel confronted me, asking why I had let this continue. I almost answered with anger. Instead, I said, I did not continue it. I stopped protecting it. He stared as though hearing a foreign language. 2 days. Later, Martin called. The refinance had been frozen pending review of supporting claims. Not criminal, but serious enough. Serious enough for partners to worry. Serious enough for a son who once built status on borrowed sacrifice to feel the floor move. I sat on my porch that evening watching light fade over the lake and realized exposure had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a family grievance. It had become a public correction. And once truth enters reputation, it does not leave quietly. The first visible loss came quietly. Daniel's development partners announced they were restructuring a pending acquisition without him. No scandalous press release.
No dramatic accusation.
Just a line in a legal notice and a phone call not returned. In the world Daniel worshipped, exclusion was often delivered in polite language. It still cut. A week later, he arrived at my cottage unannounced, not in the tailored confidence he once wore like a second skin, but in a wrinkled sport coat, shoulders slightly lowered, carrying the fatigue of a man discovering charm does not negotiate with documentation. He stood on my porch looking older than his 42 years. They are treating me like I lied, he said. I opened the screen door and answered. You did. It was the first time in his life I had said something so plain to him. He sat at my kitchen table, where morning light fell across the trust papers Martin had prepared. For several minutes he spoke in spirals, about misunderstandings, about Monica being frightened, about lenders overreacting. But eventually even self-justification tires. Then he asked the question underneath all the others. Are you changing the estate? I looked at him for a long moment. Mothers recognize when sons seek inheritance disguised as reconciliation. I am restoring boundaries, I said. Which was true. The trust amendment removed him as discretionary controller of anything tied to the family house proceeds. Assets would move to his children directly, insulated from him. I signed that afternoon. Not out of revenge. Out of clarity. Daniel watched me sign, and for the first time I saw grief, not outrage, in his face. But consequences had moved beyond our table by then. Monica's social circle had thinned. Invitations slowed. The country club board declined to renew their membership, citing unrelated policy changes no one believed. A charitable foundation quietly replaced Daniel on a donor advisory slate. More painful still, people who once admired him began speaking to him with caution rather than deference. Respect withdrawn leaves a soundless bruise. One evening Robert called to tell me the refinance had not merely stalled. It had collapsed. The bank had flagged credibility concerns and suspended the package entirely. More than $2 million in leveraged expansion sat stranded. Daniel had built so much of his image on momentum, he had forgotten how fragile momentum is when trust cracks. Weeks passed. I did not pursue punishment. I did not need to. Reality was proving more disciplined than vengeance. Then Monica called me, unexpectedly weeping, asking if I would tell Daniel's partners none of this had been intentional. I listened. Once she had whispered not to be sensitive when I was humiliated at my own son's table. Now sensitivity had found her doorstep. I cannot testify against paper, I told her. It was the kindest refusal I knew. Later that month Daniel came again. No arguments, this time. Only silence over coffee. Before leaving he looked around a cottage, at the lake beyond the porch, at the life I had begun shaping without his approval. You really are happier here, he said. I thought of the old house, the receipts, the years hidden inside ordinary sacrifice. I am freer here, I answered. After he left I stood at the window and understood something I had not when this began. The deepest penalty was not financial loss, though he suffered that. It was that my son had been forced to see himself without the flattering mythology he had curated. Some men never survive that mirror unchanged. Whether Daniel would, I did not know. But I knew this. The power had shifted completely. He came now not as benefactor, not as owner of the story, but as a man standing outside a door he once believed he controlled. And I no longer opened it out of obligation. By June the lake had turned a deep blue in late afternoon, and I had begun measuring time not by family obligations, but by quieter rituals. Coffee on the porch at sunrise. Roses climbing the fence. Letters from my grandchildren written in careful, uneven handwriting, because the trust one created had not punished them for their father's vanity. It protected them from it. That distinction mattered to me. Daniel came less often now, but when he did he no longer arrived with arguments prepared. He arrived with a humility that looked unfamiliar on him, almost borrowed. One evening he sat beside me on the porch, while swallows moved over the water, and asked whether I had ever intended to forgive him. I thought a long time before answering. Forgiveness, people say, is soft. They confuse it with surrender. I released anger. I told him, that is not the same as restoring what you damaged. He nodded, though I could see he had hoped for something easier. Then he asked about the trust amendment, whether there was any path to changing it back. I almost smiled. Even wounded pride still circles the old throne.
No, I said.
That decision is finished. The word finished carried peace in it. I had spent too much of life treating boundaries as temporary. Now they felt architectural. A week later Martin invited me to lunch and brought final documents confirming the estate revisions had recorded cleanly. The family house had sold above asking. Proceeds were secured. Daniel held no control. Legal closure has a quiet elegance. It does not shout. It seals. Yet the truest closure came unexpectedly at a small 4th of July gathering when several neighbors asked how I had found courage to confront my son publicly. Courage. I had never named it that. I told them courage often arrives looking like exhaustion. One day you simply become too tired to keep carrying a false version of yourself for someone else's comfort. Later that night Daniel called. His voice was subdued. He said he had turned down a new partnership because he wanted first to repair what greed in him had distorted. I listened. Then I told him something I had understood only recently. Your greatest loss was not the refinance, or the board seat, or the deals.
It was.
Believing status made you taller than the hands that raised you.
Silence met that.
Then a quiet, I know. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he was learning. But my life no longer depended on his learning. That was freedom. Months after the anniversary dinner, one final moment gave the story its shape. Daniel and I attended my granddaughter's school recital. During intermission, an acquaintance approached and, meaning no harm, remarked that Daniel must be proud supporting his mother all these years. The old lie, drifting in from some stale corner of town. Daniel looked at me, then turned and said clearly, "No, my mother built what I stood on." I forgot that once. He said it without performance, without audience management, simply as truth. I felt something inside me settle, not because he redeemed the past. Some things remain scarred, but because he finally carried publicly what I had carried alone. Driving home, I realized payoff does not always arrive in spectacle. Sometimes it arrives when the person who diminished you is forced to become witness to your rightful place. My son had paid in money, reputation, and humiliation, but he had also been remade by loss. And I had gained something far rarer than revenge. Authority. I was no longer the mother edited out of her own story. I was the author of its ending. When I looked out over the lake that night, I did not feel victorious over Daniel. I felt restored over myself. And there is no higher seat than that. Autumn arrived with a kind of clear, cold mornings Harold used to love, and with it came the final turn neither Daniel nor Monica had been able to prevent. The refinance review that had once seemed an inconvenience ended in a formal withdrawal from the bank, and word spread through Daniel's business circle that material misrepresentations tied to personal financial standing had cost him not only that expansion but a second development consortium that refused to renew his equity position. 2 deals gone. More than $2 million in projected profit vanished. Men who once sought his advice now kept polite distance. Monica's careful social kingdom, built on appearances and whispered rankings, fractured even faster. Invitations dried up. Committees replaced her quietly. The country club membership she had treated like a title was gone by winter. None of it came through scandal sheets or public spectacle. It came through the colder justice of doors closing. And somehow that made it heavier. But the true reckoning arrived at the estate closing. Martin had arranged a final reading of the amended trust, not because law required ceremony, but because clarity deserves witnesses. Daniel sat across from me in Martin's office, shoulders lower than I had ever seen them. Monica beside him, silent. My grandchildren were represented in the trust. The documents were read line by line. Proceeds from the family home sale secured in protected accounts. Educational trusts funded. The lake cottage, solely mine. Daniel removed entirely from discretionary control over every family asset touched by my labor. It was legal, irrevocable, final. When Martin finished, he slid the signature copy toward me. I signed with the same steady hand that had signed mortgage checks for 3 decades. Daniel looked at the papers a long while and then asked, voice almost hollow, "There is no appeal?" Martin answered before I could. None. I felt no cruelty in hearing it, only completion. Outside the law office, Daniel stopped me in the parking lot. Wind moved dry leaves across the pavement. He said he had spent months wanting to ask one question and fearing the answer. Why had I brought the receipts that night instead of leaving in silence as I always had before? I looked at my son, not as the wounded boy I once excused, nor as the arrogant man who had tried to diminish me before strangers, but simply as a man finally forced to meet consequence. Because, I said, I did not raise you so you could inherit my silence as property. He cried then, openly. I had imagined once that moment would satisfy me. It did not satisfy. It clarified. There is a difference. Weeks later, at a holiday fundraiser where Daniel had once presided like a prince, I was invited to speak on legacy and resilience. Me. The woman once introduced as dependent. I stood at the podium in a navy suit, looked across a ballroom full of people who knew exactly what had happened and said only this. If anyone tells you age makes you powerless, hand them the records. Laughter rose, then applause, warm and sustained. In the front row, Daniel stood and joined it.
Publicly. No hesitation.
In that sound, I heard the lie die completely. My grandchildren later framed the oldest mortgage receipt, March 1993, and hung it in my cottage study above Harold's photograph. Not as evidence anymore, as inheritance. Daniel rebuilt some part of his career over time, smaller, humbler, without the mythology he once fed. Monica never regained the standing she prized. Some prices do not reverse. And I did not reverse them for her. As for me, the final balance sheet was simple. My son lost money, status, and the illusion that he stood above the woman who made his beginning possible. I gained legal control, public honor, and something richer than vindication. I gained authorship. On the first anniversary of that disastrous dinner, I sat on my porch at sunrise with coffee warming my hands and opened the old leather folder one last time. Then I closed it for good. Paid in full. That was the phrase stamped on the final mortgage release, and I smiled at how life had echoed paper. Because in every way that mattered, the debt of humiliation had been collected, the false story foreclosed, the legacy returned to its rightful owner. I had not merely defended my name. I had taken back the ground beneath it. And no one would ever again tell a room I lived off my son without being corrected by the history he could not outrun.